Sehr geehrte Mitglieder des Bundestages, liebe Carolin.
Dear members of Parliament, dear Carolin Emcke, dear Valentin Groebner, dear Christina Nord, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to welcome you at the House of World Cultures. This is a project labeled Narrating War, and we are happy to have you here. I'm very happy to welcome the artists and participants of the conference. Marcel Ophuls is here, and this is a major honor for us. 2014 will be a year of anniversaries. In addition to the fall of the wall, which happened 25 years ago, we remember the beginning of two big wars which characterized the 20th century in Europe. World War I began 100 years ago. World War II began 75 years ago. These two figures, however, also underline that we are living in a society whose majority has not experienced a war in person, nor suffered the pain, the violence, and the destruction wars bring about. But then we are increasingly involved in wars elsewhere, and the wars of others have become our wars, in spite of the fact that they happen far away from Germany. We send our soldiers to Afghanistan and to African nations. Wars in other parts of the world also reach us via the people who flee the war theaters in the 1990s. It was mostly people from the Balkan states. Today, we are seeing refugees from Somalia to Syria. War has become a part of our own living reality, of our own lives here in Europe, and we have to find ways and means to react. Also, in dealing with the refugees who are coming here, but also with respect to the political decisions about interventions to make. In order to be able to act adequately, it's not sufficient to teach abstract knowledge about wars. We need to tell about, report from, but in particular, we need to focus on the narration of war. So we have to explore the forms of presentation. The question is whether language as such is sufficient. Let me give you an example. Captain Carolin wrote into his diary during the Battle of Verdun, "I've arrived here with 175 men. I'm returning with 34. Half of them is crazy." Now, there is, first of all, a rather sober statement to be read in the diary, and that's due to the language of the report. Numbers, mostly. Numbers organize the events which are being reported, and these events seem to be a statistic, and the very sober approach is being maintained up to the last but one word. But then there is the last word in the report or in the entry of Captain Carolin in his diary. Crazy, he says, and this goes beyond the canonical form. The objective world of figures, numbers, and categories is being contradicted by his personal assessment. The distance is being given up, and the event all of a sudden appears in the light of an existential exception which a human being can hardly bear. The last word also casts a shadow on what has been said before. It opposes the form of the report, which seems to be the helpless gesture of a power machine that tries to use numbers in order to tell what cannot be told, to explain what cannot be explained. The diary of Captain Cochin is, in fact, an act of subversion because it consciously goes beyond the traditional form. It does not only reflect the events in the sense of the mimesis, it's rather using the poetic approach in order to shape the events. Language is thus being replaced by images, and these images shape the way we understand wars. Now, these images also establish realities. They are often enacted, and maybe the two most important counterpoints in the enactments of the last years were the destruction of the towers in Manhattan and President Bush on the aircraft carrier, who claimed that his mission had been accomplished. His appearance was a gesture of the empire in order to define the reality by determining the images shown. Now, it is not too difficult to decode these major enactments, but then we are also faced with a flood of images in the internet. These are major challenges posed to us today because we have to ask questions. Who produces the images? What do the images show? Have these images been manipulated, technically changed? We need new grammars, the new grammars of viewing in view of the technical possibilities, and a flood of images which the individual can hardly decode anymore. The explosion of images is to be seen in the context of the possibility of reading them. We do see images, but we don't know what they tell us. I can only insinuate what the questions are we are dealing with when talking about narrating war. And I'm very happy to note that the curators have managed to invite important protagonists of texts and the production of images in order to talk about the production in an extremely interesting and complex program. These might be the first steps in order to set up a grammar of reading. And I would like to thank the curators, Carolin Emcke, Valentin Groebner, and Christina Nord for the wonderful concept of these thematic days and for the confidence and trust and their collaborations. I would also like to thank the Cultural Foundation of Federal Government and its director, Hortensia Völkers. And, of course, I would like to thank the Ministry for Culture and the Media and the Foreign Office, who are supporting us, sponsoring us, and thus making events like this one possible. Welcome to all of you.
Why narrating war? What's supposed to be so special about narrating war? War and violence confuse. They penetrate into a world that has been intact hitherto. They change a landscape and a social order. They divide a society according to ethnic markers that nobody had known they exist and that had no relevance in a political existential context. War and violence are an anomaly. They irritate, they confuse those who are subjected to them. They don't make sense. They cannot be described with familiar terms and concepts. The experience seems to be decoupled of everything that used to be valid before, decoupled of everything that determined individual perception and intuition. And so the impressions and experience in war undermines not only normative, but also psychic and aesthetic certainties. The reality of war seems to be a distortion of everything that was there before. The victims And also bystanders can't believe what they're experiencing. But how could they believe the things they see and experience exist? How could they understand that whole blocks of houses were destroyed overnight? How can you find an orientation when you are no longer reminded of the neighborhood you grew up in, where the big tower is no longer there, or where the reassuring dome of the mosque has been destroyed? How can one grasp this? Who wouldn't look in disbelief at dogs who run about with human limbs in their mouth? Who wouldn't feel dizzy when hearing the sound of the bombs, the vibrations of the detonations, and the heat of burning buildings? Who wouldn't feel lost if orange groves in front of your windows have been burned down, the old olive trees are uprooted, and the library with the old books has been devastated? The moral shock at injustice and violence of war is preceded by the cognitive disturbance at a world that seems to be completely upside down. Sometimes perception cannot follow the events. It's as if there's something resisting inside you and where you have a resistance to understand these cruel things that happen as real. War and violence undermine all normative expectations, everything we consider possible from a moral perspective. Who would we be if we could simply believe and understand that man can humiliate, torment, imprison, abuse, torture, and kill one another with or without orders? Who would we be if we could recognize ourselves in these situations as perpetrators or victims? Who would we be if we could no longer trust ourselves and others without being amazed at being able to trust at all? Who would we be if we could simply believe that nobody cares, that the international community out there knows what is happening, but this international community is not even willing and ready to call a war and a genocide? Next to this initial shock at the incomprehensible nature of war, there is the shock of the victims in the face of what war does to them. It's not just the landscape around them that is no longer recognizable. They themselves somehow are no longer the same person they used to be. World, the self, and the voice get lost, writes the American philosopher Elaine Scarry about the power of pain and violence. Narrating war is not a new topic, it's an old one. The war is back. This is what the German media have said time and again ever since the Balkan Wars in the 1990s, and that's 25 years ago, talking about the war in the years of the first Iraq War in 1991, with the TV images with bombs falling onto Baghdad. The special effect was talking about media in the first place, talking about the power of pictures and moving pictures at that. If you try to enumerate all the bloody armed conflicts that you have heard of during the last 10, 20, or 25 years, while we are talking here in Kiev, in Syria, in the Central African Republic, people die. And there are different levels of intensity when reporting about those casualties. They exist, those theaters of war of the 21st century. Afghanistan, Caucasus, Congo, Kosovo, Sierra Leone, Somalia, Syria, Sudan, an overload of wars in the media. He mixed them up, those places. In the perception of the media consumer, they amalgamate to a kind of bizarre murderous somewhere else that's in different places. In documentaries like War Photographer 2001, the war reporter went to places that were thousands of kilometers apart. Politologists have tried to coin a new term for this overload, the term new wars, a term introduced by Mary Calder and used by Herfried Münkler successfully in Germany. This term emphasizes the privatization of warfare, the extreme asymmetric relationships between the war parties, the new economies of violence, where the media play a special role themselves. The massacre and the report about the massacre has become a means of warfare. Whether this is so new, well, one can have doubts about that from a historical perspective. But the modern age, at the beginning of the 21st century, when it becomes really modern, with its changing coalitions and blurred boundaries, it all looks so pre-modern, and so much pre-modern that in politology in the 21st century, a new school emerges that is called neo-medievalism, in order to describe non-state actors and informal networks, the new Middle Ages. That's the title of a famous article that came out in Foreign Affairs. And these Middle Ages happen now in Congo, in Syria, in Libya, and elsewhere. So how old is the new thing? War is obviously always described in terms of the past, and especially when we are talking about future wars. Few military conflicts offer such wonderful opportunities like the war that was mentioned by Bernd Scherer that started exactly 100 years ago. After the First World War had broken out, even well-informed specialists tried to describe it for many years in old images and categories of yesterday, personal heroism, religious crusades, national values. Until this winter 1916-70s, the images that were used to narrate war were much more influenced by the past than by the new murderous innovations that had taken place at the fronts. Obviously, this has something to do with the fact that the First World War was the first war that had taken place in the age of the modern mass press and the cheap daily newspapers. When the printing presses run quickly, said a military historian, it's not the most radical ideas to become widespread, but the most commonplace and understandable ones. Such paradox interactions between wars and the narrations of the war, the images of the war in the media, have been repeated many times in the 20th century. The whole rhetoric apparatus of the good war, the Second World War, still characterizes war reporting in the US with its familiar and reassuring images and formula. It seems extremely difficult to describe the things that happen today in wars in normal, new, modern terms and images without relying to the old cliches that seem to work even better because everybody believes they know them. Remembrance, the buzzword of cultural studies of the last 20 years, which imposes duties, has also a number of cognitive side costs because these recollections of the wars of yesterday are carried out in order to make other pasts disappear. It's interesting to see how in the European remembrance, not the German, but the French, English, and Dutch remembrance, the lost wars of the 50s and 60s in their former colonies in Asia and Africa are systematically downplayed, have been denied for 15 years. Although, or maybe because these wars are so much more in line with today's complex political realities than the memorialized atrocities of the Second World War. In other words, narrating war reporting in the 20th century looks different when it takes place in a house of world cultures and is not focused on apparatuses of national perception with its familiar big categories like generation and remembrance. And this is what we wanted to try. We want to try to talk about history and war history, not in terms of a repetition of things that we all know. We would like to grasp the opportunity to see alien new things in what we consider to be so familiar. How many old texts, even very old texts are enshrined in the narrations of the wars of the 21st century. Using the clichés of the past is less harmless than it seems at a first glance. Historians are usually seen as strenuous people, but rather harmless. But invocations of the Middle Ages become very threatening when they're used by lawyers. The U.S. Minister of Justice, Alberto Gonzales, and his prosecutor, John Ashcroft, have said in 2002 and 2005, when in the U.S. Senate, that the members of failed states and feudal or medieval organizations can be tortured. These people are now not subject to the Geneva Convention because it protects only members of regular national states. The Middle Ages, the pre-modernity a la Rumsfeld and Gonzales, was at the same time the primitive form of organization of the old day. And it's also used today. People say that competence that seem to come from the Middle Ages may be subjected to any kind of torture, waterboarding, electrical shocks, and unlimited internment in camps. But there is a second reason why we should be careful about the old categories of the past. The modern media see themselves, of course, as agents of the Enlightenment, but they are only effective because the consumers believe the stories of the media. And it's not a coincidence that belief is also a religious work. Peter Carey has ironically said consuming news is very similar to religious rituals. Both the rituals and the news take the consumer away from the daily routine. They have the illusion that they see events that are beyond their own horizon, beyond their everyday life, and this seems to be so much more authentic and relevant than their own world. And like the pictures of pre-modern religiousness, these news are reassuring when they talk about horrible things elsewhere, because there you see your own everyday life is safe and secure. And you can use such news also in order to attribute to your own group the status of a victim. Because self-victimization of the audience and witnesses can be carried out when we talk about the war in our safe and prosperous Europe. What we would like to do with narrating war is to dissect the official ready-made narrations, to decompose them. We'd like to tell these narratives backwards and go back down the lane of these narratives to the original worlds and experiences. Because these worlds are not just the worlds of the professional observers and the historians and literature scholars, but also the displaced, the interned, the excluded. How can they talk? How can they narrate war? The victims of the war, people who overnight became refugees, who had to leave their country, their work, their family, everything and everyone they loved. Those victims don't know how to talk about that, how to tell others who they used to be before they became a refugee. The victims of the war who overnight became prisoners, who no longer had an individuality, no intimacy, no physical integrity. People who were raped, people who all of a sudden are locked in like animals. They're tortured and humiliated at random. They get shot at. People whose existence is reduced to mere survivals do not know how to convey this experience to people they talk to. Those who for weeks and months and years have had no subjectivity, who were denied as individuals, who had no one to talk to. For them it seems strange when they now can speak. What they could do before the war, just talk to people, look at them, doesn't seem normal anymore. Those who for many years had been reduced to fear and hunger can hardly believe that all of a sudden there's somebody who wants to listen to them, to their story. And so the narrations of the victims of war and violence are often unsettling and upset. Some people stammer. Some people talk too fast. They can't find the words. Sometimes their narration has lost its linear form. These people talk to one narrative or psychic threshold, and then they talk backwards. There are gaps, omissions. Sometimes these people are silent for weeks or even years. For those who became perpetrators in the war, this phenomenon also exists. The shock how war has deformed their own personality, their own psyche. War and violence has not just an effect on the victims, but also on the perpetrators. Those who didn't even know that they are capable of tormenting and killing others. They don't know how to say what war did to them because they hardly know who they are and who they can talk to about this experience. Could be different motivations that make it possible or impossible to talk about the war. Some people talk in order to remember those who have not survived. They consider it their duty. They talk because they feel guilty, maybe. Some people talk in order to overcome this forced intimacy with their tormentors, because they want to share and open the knowledge that ties them to their tormentors. Some other people talk because they finally want to talk about injustice. Some people talk because they want to overcome their isolation. They want to link their story to the story of others, because that makes them feel less lonely, vulnerable, and ashamed. Some people talk in order to develop a counter-narration against those who have talked about them. They want to talk in order to overcome the stigma, in order to revert the glance that made them objects for others, moving images on a monitor and images on a screen, mere member of a team, hostages of an ideology, or collateral damage of an allegedly legitimate war. Some talk about their sufferings because they're angry. Somebody talk because they love those who have perished. Some are silent because they're ashamed at what was done to them and they couldn't resist being tormented. Some people talk in order to see the crimes atoned. Some are silent in order to spare those who are close to them. There's social conventions and religious convictions, political or cultural values and taboos that guide the narration of war and limit this narration. In a society that sees its own army just as a development aid support, it's difficult to talk about death and destruction. In a culture where talking about sexuality is a taboo, women cannot talk about histories of sexual violence that was done to them. In a society where homosexuality is criminalized, it's difficult for male victims of sexual violence to talk about their suffering. All these narrations have gaps. And it's these gaps, these breaks, and omissions we'd like to explore.
We will try to not just go and repeat the topoi you all know. We would like to offer new perspectives. And you might hear critical remarks or positive things about certain news channels or news formats. But this is not about media criticism. It's about the distortion. It's about the filters of the narrations and the images of wars. And that's why we ask, who narrates? How do we narrate? Who decides what's the price? We are also playing with the expectations of the audience, and we would like to offer, in addition to panel discussions, readings and films, a new format which we call the mirror dialogue. And that's about narration, narrating war as seen from two different sides. Narrating sounds nice, kind, neutral, but it's not a neutral process we are dealing with. Narrating implies filters and media. What is not desired is being hidden, disappears, and too complex disappears as well. Narration means scarcity, leveling, complementing, and it also implies the unexpected and the irregular. Telling stories, narrating, has always been closely linked to wars, since wars are an expression of mass and extreme violence. And this is once again the historical perspective. People begin to tell or to narrate because they want to talk about mass killings, and they have to tell about it. We will, of course, also focus on the prehistory of all these events. In the readings, for example, here we try to offer a collage, an assembly of certain elements of war reportages with a historical echo. All the other events, however, will deal with present times, with our own contemporary situation in the 21st century, and thus also focus on the endless wars which take place far away, yet the location far away is not a bizarre, murderous elsewhere. It's present in peaceful, wealthy Berlin too. And we're also dealing with the things which cannot be described, the indescribable, as it's often said, with respect to wars. And we are dealing with forms of reporters, reportages, authors, witnesses, and others. Christina Nord has curated a film program which will not only include moving images of wars, but also raises systematic questions raised by the program in general. Now, we would not want to have you leave the hall without offering a certain instruction for how to see and listen and reflect. Narrating war is a collection of thematic days within a given dramaturgy, so you may well shift or move between talks about photography and talks about writing, and you may well pursue systematic questions about the thresholds of what can be told and concrete talks and the focus on certain locations and war theaters, Syria, Vietnam, the Balkan, and Rwanda. For us, Valentin and myself, these thematic days are a great gift and experiment, and they would not have been possible without the support of many people. We would like to thank also on behalf of Christina Nord, Hortensia Völkers and the team of the Federal Cultural Foundation.
Katrin Klingern und ihr Team,
Katrin Rolle,
Desiree Förster,
Caroline Kim,
Janek Müller,
Cordula Hamschmidt,
Silvia Fehrmann und ihr Team,
Anne Meyer,
Christiane Sonntag,
Eva Stein,
Franziska Wegner,
Anna Bayraktaris,
Natalia Wajczowa,
die Leitung der Technik, Matthias Helfer und seine Mitarbeiter und die Praktikanten.
Und die beiden Dolmetscherinnen, die Sie nicht sehen, die da oben aber gerade für uns alles...
And we would like to thank the two interpreters, Astrid Gese and Silvia Schreiber. We are looking forward to 3 days full of information, curiosity, open eyes, open ears, and good nerves. Now, concerning the good nerves, you have to improvise and to have to react in view of the unexpected. Only today we have learned that Mohammed al-Atta cannot be with us today. We tried to find someone else. Abdelkader will be here tonight and will talk about Syria with Bente Scherer.